Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
It is Tuesday, June 4th, and this is another Stanley Cup Final preview edition of Daily Faceoff Live, and it is brought to you by our friends at Bet365. Our partners for these playoffs will be here with Bet365 every step of the way to give you all the news, analysis, lines, and betting options you need for these playoffs until just one team is left standing in June. And right now, there are only two teams left standing, and we are still a handful of days away from puck drop down in sunny Florida for this Stanley Cup Final between the Oilers and Panthers. And Frank, honestly, as much as the little 5-day break is nice for the players, I'll be honest, I'm not hating it either.
I think it's going to produce the best Cup Final we could possibly want. I mean, from an energy perspective, from a build-up, I know the week is annoying, but to give these guys in the middle of this slog a 5-day rest, it's not even what anyone would have designed. I don't even think the league loves 5 days without hockey. But nonetheless, I think it's going to be important for the quality of the series.
Yeah, I mean, 5 days, again, doesn't seem bad, especially when you look, I don't know if you know this, but the NBA has like 11 days off or 10 days off between the end of their conference finals and the start of the NBA finals, just because both their conference finals ended in 4 and 5 games. So it could be worse, hockey fans. It could be worse. We'll be previewing the matchup, obviously, all week. Later on today, we'll be joined by our friend Stephen Ellis to do a little bit of draft talk with the next wave. But let's start with the Stanley Cup Final, Frank. And I think one part of this series, and I think it deserves to be number one in what we're doing with our previews this week, is the star power up front between these two sides. I think that, combined with the rest, like you said, is what's going to make this Stanley Cup Final a very electric one. From Edmonton, you obviously have McDavid, Draisaitl, Hyman. From Florida, you have guys who've proven over these last two runs to be quality playoff performers. A guy like Carter Verhaeghe. There aren't a lot of players who've scored more goals over the last two playoffs than Carter Verhaeghe. Alexander Barkov on the defensive side. Matt Tkachuk with his ability to get under the other team's skin and swing momentum and energy in a game through not just a big goal, which he does a lot of, but a big hit or a big scrum. Who do you give the edge to when it comes to the star power, though?
Well, the pure star power, it's the Edmonton Oilers. I think Leon Draisaitl said it best just a couple days ago when they were heading into Game 6 against the Dallas Stars, and he said, when we're at our best, I'm paraphrasing essentially, when we're at our best, we think we are the best. And it's really hard to argue that. But when it comes to depth of the forward group, I would say that the edge still right now lies with the Florida Panthers because they have more that they can throw at you. But this is kind of the point that I'd been making all playoffs long, specifically with regard to the Vancouver Canucks or other teams that the Oilers have played. Their ceiling is just higher in Edmonton. And the real question that the Oilers are going to have to answer in this series is, how many times can you get to that ceiling with those players, and how long of a sustained period of time will it be? And that's really the differentiator, I think, in this Cup Final. Is there's a lot of really good players on the other end of this, and Tkachuk and Barkov, and you mentioned Verhaeghe, and go down the list. They're Reinhardt. I mean, there's a 50-plus goal scorer that we're talking about that doesn't even make this graphic. These are good, really good players, but they are not 97 or 29 for the Oilers. And that's why I have such a hard time going through this process in terms of trying to pick who ultimately has the edge, just to check the box in the forward category, because which one ends up winning at the end of the day?
When you look at those, well, let's go from the top of these forward groups to maybe closer to the bottom. It's obviously been a point of contention for the Oilers. They haven't gotten a lot of production from down there, although names like Connor Brown and Matthias Janmark have been finding ways to contribute away from 5-on-5. They've been great on the penalty kill. Dylan Holloway's certainly been an emergence, and I actually think this third line has given them the best chance at a full top 12, if you want to call it that. But on the Florida side, Frank, who do you look at as a potential difference maker? Because again, this should be an area that the Panthers win.
What about Vladimir Tarasenko there, spotted on the third line? He's won a Stanley Cup before. He's gone on deep playoff runs. He's someone that finds a way, even through a goal scoring drought in the playoffs, to come through in a clinching game for the Cats. How do you look past Sam Bennett and his playoff performances year in and year out? He's one of those guys that, he chips in 20 goals in the regular season, but finds a way to contribute when it matters most. We've talked and waxed poetic about, Barkov and Verhaeghe and those guys, but Sam Reinhart is playing for an enormous contract, and I have to think that there's some way to work it out and keep him in Florida after back-to-back runs to the Stanley Cup Final. This is honestly, it's not often that we get to a cup final that the two best teams from each conference are standing, and that's what I believe we have here in this cup final.
Interesting stuff. We're going to continue our previews throughout the week. Carter Hutton will give us the goaltending breakdown. We'll talk a little bit about how these two blue lines go head to head as well. But you mentioned Sam Reinhart and playing for a contract, Frank, and that ties in very nicely to what I wanted to get to next. Our boy Matt Larkin wrote an excellent piece up at dailyfaceoff.com about some guys who played in these playoffs who are pending unrestricted free agents, and what this kind of run did for their stock. And here's some of the names that our guy Matt touched on: Jake DeBrusk, Dakota Joshua. I think that's a guy in Joshua whose stock obviously went up a pretty good amount. And you do have a couple of names here on the Florida Panthers. But when you look at this list, Frank, is there anyone whose value you think maybe jumped up more than the others?
I would say Nikita Zadorov is someone who really increased his earning power or potential. If not necessarily in AAV, then probably in term. He had a monster playoff for the Vancouver Canucks. He's someone that, came in with a reputation of being a big, tough player to play against that really was a force to be reckoned with for the Canucks, that I think they're really trying hard to find a fit to keep him there. That said, I don't know if they're ultimately going to be able to do it. Will they place their priority in re-signing Filip Hronek? How will they dole out those dollars on the back end? Because you're probably already saying goodbye to Elias Lindholm on the front end, because it just doesn't seem like they can make the math work. I think the careful part when it comes to someone like Zadorov is really trying to determine what's the appropriate fit. How much is too much? Because I still think at the end of the day, he chipped in some big goals, but I think there are some limitations there. And I think when you have a player that, look, if you're going to be giving him 5 times 5 or 6 times 5.5 or whatever the number ends up coming in at, there's going to be a lot of nights for that type of pay in November, December, and January that you're not going to love that contract. It may show up well and may age well in the playoffs, but you've got to get there first. And I still think he's, an upper end number 4 defenseman in this league. He's a second pair guy. That's a really nice support piece. But when you start to get into that pay range, you're asking a lot of defensemen of that caliber. And I'm not entirely certain that after the number of teams that he's played on, that he really falls into that category.
Another name on that list that I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this summer is Jeremy Swayman. And I mean, coming into the season, Frank, I know maybe he was a little bit of the, good young goalie, but he's in that tandem, obviously, with Linus Ullmark. Sorokin's deal was 8.25. I don't think Swayman is getting to 8.25, obviously, but did Swayman maybe push himself? Yeah, did he maybe push himself more into that top tiers, legit 1A kind of money?
Yeah, I think he's really close to that. He is, I think right now, if he's not in that top tier of 5 to 7 top goalies in the league, he's certainly in that next rung down. And I'd say he's probably not in all that different of a position than, although he needs the contract right now instead of a year from now, than Jake Oettinger in Dallas. Similar age. Ottinger's played 60 some more games in the NHL than Swayman has. Swayman has better numbers, but Oettinger has demonstrated that he can do it over a longer period of time, which I think, goes to his advantage. And we were talking about what would that contract look like for Jake Oettinger on Morning Cup of Hockey today with Colby and Johnny, and just pure spitballing. Like if you're trying to go 8 years or 7 years or whatever it is, I think Jake Oettinger is probably just in that $7.5 to $8 million range. It's going to be expensive. Does Swayman get to that level? It's going to be really close. He's definitely, pushing the sevens for sure.
So those are a couple of guys who've seen their value shoot up over the last 4 to 6 weeks here. But let's go to the flip side, and we put sell at the bottom. Who are some guys, Frank, whose stock maybe isn't what we thought it would be? And a couple of names that I know you've talked about in the past, and maybe we'll start there because they're on teams who are now out of the playoffs. But it's Elias Lindholm in Vancouver and Brett Pesce in Carolina. They're both still quality players, but is their payday maybe not going to be what they thought it would be back in, say, January?
Well, how about go back to last September or October for Elias Lindholm when he was with Calgary? I think their offer was at the very bare minimum 8 times 8 for $64 million. They might have gone even as high as 8.5, which would be $68 million. The latest AFP projection that we have is 6 times 575, or sorry, 5 times 675 is the latest projection, which is $34 million. So if you're doing the math at home, that means that Elias Lindholm, if it comes anywhere close to that, as at the very least, probably cost himself $30 million between September and now. And I just saw your face. It was like, it's like the scene in Dumb and Dumber where, you're just like, oh my God, that makes you sick to think about that much money being left on the table. That is John Klingberg, like in terms of what he didn't end up re-signing for in Dallas. And that hurts. It's tough to stomach. And in some ways might even help explain the season that Lindholm had after that. You don't get the start you want. You're playing on a team that's not in playoff contention. And all of a sudden things start to spiral a little bit. You get traded, you get a little banged up. Lindholm had a good playoff, but I think with the variability of his production and the fact that we know now that he's not a driver, but he's a great complementary piece, whether he plays on the wing or at center, that's going to cost him some serious money in free agency. We're talking, a great 2C if that's what you're looking for, but he's certainly not a number one, and it's going to be a huge hit to his wallet. But Pesce, I don't know that. Well, I guess I should say I do know that there wasn't the same situation at play for him, meaning the Canes never really made him an offer. So he went through this season knowing that this was probably going to be the end. I don't think they ever really got serious in discussions. And for him, the big hit was just offensive production. Part of that is opportunity. Part of that is what you can do at even strength. And he just hasn't piled up the points in a way that makes him nearly as valuable as some of the other commodities on the market. And he's a solid player who skates so well. He's certainly going to be in demand, but not probably to the level that he was hoping to cash in on. And that could also potentially, if you want to look at it from the other perspective, be a pretty decent value proposition for another team.
Could be. Another couple of guys we had on there just quickly. One was Warren Fogle in Edmonton. That one was top of mind for me. I wanted a guy who's going into the Cup final, but he was a 20-goal scorer this year for the Oilers, with a lot of that coming at even strength. And the talk in Edmonton was, whoa, he might, he was 2.75 against the cap. After a 20-goal season playing lower on the depth chart in Edmonton, maybe some team that's, rebuilding wants to add in a guy in his mid to late 20s. He could get more than that this year. Another name that's going to be playing in these Cup finals is Brandon Montour, Frank. And you had highlighted him a couple weeks back as a guy who'd maybe lost out on a bit of steam coming into free agency. Do you think either one of those guys has a chance to rebuild some value in the Cup final? I look at Montour as like, hey, maybe going up against Connor McDavid, he moves well. Maybe some teams get a look and go, whoa, he is capable of keeping up with high-end talent.
Well, I think he is. It's just that he was looking in a totally different pay scale after last season. So they get to the final last year. He had 16 goals last season and 73 points. This year he was way down at 33 points. And yeah, he didn't come back until November. So I don't think you can hold that against him, especially also coming off of surgery. But when you're playing 24 minutes a night and scoring 73 points, your expectations heading into this season are a lot different. He also had 8 playoff goals last year, 8. As a defenseman. That's a huge number. He's not close to that heading into the final. He's at 3 so far, and he's been good. But, if you're trying to be in the 8s or 9s, and then you have the season that you do, it's just, it's not going to necessarily correlate. So, certainly probably, I guess, what a lot of people would look at Montour and just say this was a regression back to the average. I think he's a great defender. He could play on my team any day the way that he skates. It's just that the thing is, you're not, if you're not a 70-point defenseman, it's just a different conversation.
Yeah, that's fair. Quickly before we get to Stephen Ellis, let's continue our Summer Ahead series and take a look at Colorado, one of the teams bounced in the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, Frank, and some interesting decisions lay ahead for Chris McFarland out in the Mile High State. Casey Middlestat, that deal, I think, ended up looking pretty good. Probably a guy they find, ground on. He's a pending RFA, but the big question is probably what ends up happening with Nichushkin, because that immediately impacts how much money they have, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing, is they're not actually able to, well, I guess internally they could make a decision, but he's not eligible to have his contract terminated right now. And I'm sure they're also weighing, hey, this is a really important piece for us. How do we handle this situation? My personal take is that they might be done with him. I know that's tough to take because addiction is a real thing, and certainly hope he gets the help that he needs. But in this spot now, when it matters most, 2 years in a row, you have an issue that pops up with drugs. I think a lot of trust has eroded. I think a lot of trust eroded with the players in that room. I think a lot of trust eroded with their front office. And now, because of his cap hit and situation, they need to manage this appropriately in terms of what happens next. I think they made the trade Middlestat for Byram, knowing full well what they were getting into and what that next contract looks like. So that probably won't be too difficult. I saw a report that Chris McFarland is meeting with Jonathan Drouin's agent, Alan Walsh, this week at the Combine in Buffalo. So I'd imagine there's probably some place to find common ground there for Drouin coming off of an important season. And also the comments that were made repeatedly by Jared Bednar about how he was surprised how complete of a player Drouin was. But then what happens with someone like Sean Walker on the back end? I don't see a path that they can afford him. It seemed like one deal for one moment in time where you also were able to move off of the Johansson deal. And then how do you find a way to get more depth? Landeskog still a question mark, whether he comes back. And that's the one thing that's changed from the Avs from, a couple years ago when you win the Stanley Cup, is when you don't have Kadri and Landeskog, it's hard to make the argument that your team is nearly as deep as it once was. And probably the end for Zach Parise. Like you're going to have to go out and reinvent some depth.
Yeah. JT Compher was another big part of those cup winning teams. I know they've added pieces as well. Quickly, 60 or even 30 seconds. How active will they be on the goalie market?
They seem to be pretty big believers in Justus Annunen. So obviously the Georgiev contract, that's not going anywhere either. I don't foresee them being super active. I really don't. I think they're hoping that Georgiev starts off on a better foot next season and is able to carry it all the way through.
We are in early June. It's all about the Stanley Cup Final. By the end of June, it'll be all about the NHL draft. Let's get into that a little bit more with the next wave and Stephen Ellis. Always a pleasure to welcome in our daily Faceoff draft analyst, Stephen Ellis, to the show, and a handful of things we want to hit on, Stephen. And one real interesting thing, especially in the early rounds, is size, right? Sometimes scouts get enamored. Teams fall in love with a guy because he's big. I get that. Sometimes it results in some pretty hilarious whiffs looking back. But who are some players who stand out to you, not just because of their size, but also the ability that comes with it?
Well, for sure, we're looking at Anton Silyev, the Russian defenseman. We've talked about him a bunch of times already on this show, a guy that no one kind of saw having the season he did. His offense kind of fell off, but that's not his game. At 6'7", you're not expecting him to go out there and put up 20 points. But for him to play 20 minutes a night this year, it really showed that that's a big step forward. When it comes to Russian prospects, so many just get lost in the system where they're not playing a ton of minutes. Matvei Michkov, for example, gets moved to a different team just to get playing time. So to see him go out there and play as much as he did this year was really good. But one guy I really like, and maybe the next 6'7" player taken in the draft, the first round of the draft this year, is Dean Letourneau out of St. Andrews. This guy put up over 60 goals this year. Yeah, you see the points. He can overpower players with his physicality. And every time I went to watch St. Andrews play this year, he was just by far the best player, even against Shaddix, which had some star players. And a fun fact, I almost ruined my own plans to propose to my now fiance when I went to go watch St. Andrews play. And I was going to for a minute or so and then get out there to do my proposal. But I just was so excited watching Dean Letourneau score like he does. And yeah, it worked out, but it almost kind of ruined my plans there.
Yeah, you were almost left with Letourneau being your first round draft choice. Congratulations. Steven, I say this all the time, and anyone watching, they'd know that you watch some seriously obscure hockey. Like if it's like France against Belgium or Kazakhstan against Lithuania, you're all over it. But when it comes to this year's draft, you wrote a piece about some prospects from what we would call non-traditional hockey countries. Who are some of those players that caught your eye?
Well, yeah. So one name that has caught my eye is Bruno Idzan out of Croatia, left winger. Played with the senior Division 2A team a couple weeks ago, and I watched him, and just the way he moved the puck, it didn't look like a guy who was a first-year eligible. So that was impressive. I know a lot of people, myself included, were a little surprised that Tommaso De Luca out of Italy wasn't drafted last year. A guy that some people thought could go as high as the third round, just put up some really good numbers. And but in Spokane, but this year he went out there and had one of the more productive seasons by a U20 player in the top league in Switzerland, which is really impressive. Kenta Isage out of Japan, another winger that I think is drawing a lot of attention there, is a guy who, we've seen a lot of these players that have come out of Japan the last couple of years, and then they get lost because they're too small and they're not strong enough. And that doesn't seem to be the issue here, so that's good. Urban Podjakar, watching him this year in Niagara and seeing the stuff he's able to do, a Slovenian prospect, one of many that could get drafted. And one that's also really interesting is Alexander Levshin, a Ukrainian goalie that played AAA this year. I got to see him a few times with the Toronto Nationals, and didn't play a whole lot, but when he went out there and represented the Division 1A Ukrainian team, he almost single-handedly brought that team to the top group. Just an unbelievable tournament. So it's hard to tell if these guys will be drafted, but in terms of the guys from smaller countries, I know these guys are definitely on the NHL team's radars.
We've talked about big risers before in the draft, and a lot of times we focus on the guys who jump from 25 to 10 or may work their way into being early first round picks. But there's also guys who maybe shoot their way up from being mid round picks to like a second or a third round pick. Anyone in that area that has kind of caught your attention as of late?
Well, for sure, it's got to be Sam O'Reilly, who we just saw play at the Memorial Cup with the London Knights, and didn't put up a ton of points there. A weird tournament for London in general, but it's kind of like Easton Cowan last year, where all it took was just a really good second half to kind of make people go, "Oh yeah, this guy is something here." And with him, he was playing Junior B last year, so wasn't really sure what type of role he was going to play. But watching him in the Memorial Cup this year, there were a few guys that I felt were consistently better. And for him to go out there and just control the puck, like he knows what he wants to do with it. He's really smart, can play with anybody in that lineup, whether it be Cowan, whether it be Denver Barkey. He could play center, he could play wing. He's someone that some scouts have wondered if he's a late first round pick, if he's one of those late riser guys. I'm thinking maybe at best we're looking at a second rounder, but he was on no one's radar to start the season. So for him to kind of be such an important part of London's championship push this year, I think he's going to get taken pretty high.
Fantastic stuff, Mr. Ellis. Appreciate your time as always. Loving the draft coverage over at dailyfaceoff.com. Enjoy these final 20-some days before the NHL draft.
Thank you so much.
Our daily face-off inbox question is brought to you by Douglas Mattresses. You can order yours today at douglas.ca/DFO. Their mattresses are handcrafted in Canada, ensuring the highest quality materials and fastest delivery to you. Douglas.ca/DFO. Frank, how about this? We got a Habs fan in our chat here on June 4th. Ben,
why don't we have more of them, by the way?
It's also a decent point. Maybe a hashtag AskDFO. What's something big the Habs could do this summer? Do you think they have an appetite to do something big?
Well, I think they need more difference makers. That's the one thing that stands out for me. And I'm like, I know it's the unholy thing to think about, but like Mitch Marner, Montreal Canadiens. Like, I don't think it's ever going to happen. I don't think the Leafs would even make the deal, but that should be the type of quality of player that the Habs with their prospects and picks and also their burgeoning defense core, like that's exactly the type of thing that they should be trying to get in on. Same thing with like a Marty Necas from Carolina. I think he's someone that has some game-breaking talent that could be one of those players that they'd be targeting.
And the bad blood's gone between Carolina and Montreal because both GMs have moved on, right?
I don't know that it ever truly ends when you have owners involved, but
that's the first
I still love to see it. I would love to see something like that happen.
Yeah. All right. Let's move along to our daily bets brought to you by Bet365, the largest sports betting platform globally. Open an account today with Bet365 and use the promo code DAILY365 to get in on a huge range of markets. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Frank, we're going to keep it simple today, but I will say I got some really in the weeds series long bets that I'm going to be given for the final 3 days leading up to the Cup. But today it's simple. It's a Conn Smythe heat check. We did this before the start of the conference finals, so why not revisit it right now? Connor McDavid is the favorite, and I think that would be more because of what he could be capable of doing in the Cup final, not so much what he's done up to this point. But when you look at this list, I think a lot of people would point out, Leon Draisaitl's probably been the Oilers MVP, but who do you think's been that guy for the Panthers?
I mean, on a pure MVP basis, probably Barkov. And then as good as Bobrovsky's been, I'd probably lean towards Verhaeghe and then Tkachuk, but that's just pure eyeball, right? Like, obviously my eye doesn't reflect what the board looks like. And part of that's also because we don't know how the public money has come into this point. But I'd say there's such little value on McDavid, plus the fact that almost everyone would agree that Draisaitl to this point has been their MVP on the run. Conn Smythe voting is interesting because I'm part of the group that helps select the 16 or 18 voters that we end up having. And I have no idea how they would view a McDavid candidacy. Yeah.
You're talking about public money. One thing just I've noticed myself, Stuart Skinner yesterday was 100-1. This morning we wake up, he is 50-1. So he's been cut in half. And maybe moving away from the betting talk, Frank, and I'll give you another just general Ask DFO question. It's playoff MVP, right? Not final MVP. So when you as a voter, and I don't know how much insight you can even give me, but how much do you weight the two? Do you say like, hey, the performance in the Cup final is worth like 70% of my ballot and how I'm going to view this? How do you look at it?
I'd say it's definitely not 70. It's closer to 50. I mean, when it matters most, that's the toughest time to elevate with the most pressure, the most eyeballs, the most on the line. So there's certainly a fair bit of the Cup final that weighs into it, but it's really not a one series award. It's an award for all 4 rounds. And I think you'd be hard pressed to have anyone say, as good as he's been, that McDavid's been the Oilers' best player. So that's why it's tough to look at that board and say, oh yeah, that aligns. But then you see game 6 and then you're like, man, if the Oilers get this close and McDavid just absolutely goes off, could he win the Conn Smythe? For sure he can.
Yeah. He is the favorite right now, courtesy of our friends at Bet365. Let's wrap up the show with a little garbage time, brought to you by Wendy's. They only ever use fresh, never frozen beef in all of their burgers, whether it's a JBC, a Dave's Single, or a Baconator. You can guarantee that beef has never seen the inside of a freezer. Order today. Check out the latest deals by using the Wendy's app. Frank, you showed me this yesterday or pointed me towards it, and you were dying laughing before the show. I wanted to work it in yesterday. We couldn't. Gritty doing Philly cheesesteak reviews on his Twitter is the funniest thing going. And it ties in nicely because you're a Philly guy. You got your favorite cheesesteak spot. Did he review your spot?
Angelo's would be right at the top of the list. I think that's the best cheesesteak in the city. And it's funny that you picked that one. But anyone sizing up cheesesteaks based on length and girth and then also color, light brown, is just chef's kiss. Gritty is deep into the off-season coverage, so to speak. So I'm here for it.
It was funny. I just you reading that out yesterday before the show, before we went live, you were giggling. It was so funny.
The best part is someone tweeted me and was like, yeah, Frank would be retweeting a cheesesteak ranking. And it's like, but first off, you're missing the point. But yes, of course I am.
Good stuff. That is a wrap on today's edition of Daily Faceoff Live. We'll be back tomorrow with our pal Carter Hutton and more. So you don't want to miss it. Hit the subscribe button over on the DFO YouTube and make sure you're right back here tomorrow at noon Eastern.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.